Growing up Black in post-civil rights New Orleans meant being continually confronted by a tourist landscape of Black docility, subservience, and stereotypical distortion. And these photos were just, I took recently at some of the tourist shops in the city. Like other African-American New Orleanians, I was faced with the challenge of reconciling the omnipresence of these tourist representations with the reality of Black agency, autonomy, and community that shaped my lived experience. The predominant pre-Katrina New Orleans tourism narrative represented Black culture to tourists through two distinct but intersecting frames: desire and disaster. On the one hand, tourists were encouraged to think that they were experiencing and celebrating Black culture by eating Creole cuisine, listening to jazz music, and sharing in anecdotes of quadroon balls and secret voodoo rites. On the other hand, tourists were directed to adopt the white supremacist memory of slavery and Black culture that views the Old South with a sense of loss and nostalgia. In effect, the city's promotion of Black cultural consumption produced a desire for Blackness at the same time that this Blackness was used to signify the disaster of Black emancipation and desegregation. New Orleans pre-Katrina tourism then was part of the historically paradoxical construction of Blackness that acknowledges and celebrates Black cultural contributions while simultaneously insisting upon Black social and cultural inferiority and indicting African Americans for perceived post-bellum and post-civil rights era social ills of poverty, crime, immorality, educational inadequacy, and political corruption. These competing impulses of desire and disaster facilitated the symbolic continuance of slavery as appropriation of Black labor and denial of Black history and agency. In New Orleans' predominant tourism narrative, this dynamic was exemplified by the modernizing of slave quarters into trendy restaurants, hotels, and tourist sites, the proliferation of racially stereotypical images and merchandise on display in tourist shops, and the omnipresence of African Americans in the service industry, whose performance of happy servitude is mandated by the conventions of the local tourist economy. In each case, tourists were signaled to consume or gaze upon Black culture without the uncomfortable acknowledgement of an exploitative slave system or its persistent legacy of racial and class inequality. New Orleans tourists then became acquainted with a representation of Blackness that obscured actual Black New Orleanians. One way that the tourism narrative achieved this duality was by limiting its historical focus to the colonial and antebellum periods and by focusing exclusively on the purported exceptional race relations that distinguished New Orleans from the rest of the slaveholding South. The emphasis on selected features of these eras, such as European cultural influences, the relative freedom of New Orleans' Black population, the city's laissez-faire attitudes regarding race, the social sanctioning of interracial unions, and a large population of free Blacks, lent itself to the construction of New Orleans as benefiting from the most liberal and refined elements of Southern culture, while abdicating its most brutal, inhumane, and inegalitarian features. A dearth of mainstream tours that depict Reconstruction or civil rights history and their attendant bitter struggles for racial justice meant that the prevailing romantic, idyllic narrative of racial harmony and equality went unchallenged. One might have expected to find such a challenge in the more recent development of multicultural tourism that attempted to represent African American culture and history. After all, multicultural tourism followed the trends of the 1960s heritage industry and its populist interest in recovering the past. The central tenets of the new industry, including making history more accessible to common experience and popular memory, sustaining a multi-ethnic vision of the future, and creating a more pluralist portrayal of the past. Unlike other heritage movements that arose out of the uncertainties and seeming dislocation associated with postmodernism, the Black heritage industry took root during the modern civil rights and Black power movements. These movements marked a period of renewed optimism and possibility when African Americans gained some control in and over the institutions that could validate their own narratives, histories, and memories. In 1960s New Orleans, African Americans through local and national political and civic organizations organized at the grassroots level, litigated for desegregation, forged coalitions, engaged in direct action protests, agitated for economic opportunities, and slowly wielded their hard-won bargaining power to wrest concessions from the previously whites-only tourism industry. The crux of this bargaining power stemmed from the activists' recognition of their ability to hurt New Orleans' tourist image and disrupt the tourist trade. As historian Adam Forpo asserts, African American strategy of bluff and brinkmanship relied on the understanding that, quote, the city's dependence on tourism made white businessmen in New Orleans peculiarly sensitive to the threat of disruption. African American activists had learned to adopt a rhetoric of tourism to fight for civil rights and would eventually employ the same rhetoric to gain entry into the tourism industry itself. Increasingly, by the mid-1980s, New Orleans tour owners, guides, and promoters began responding to post-civil rights movement demands by Black New Orleanians for a stake in the burgeoning tourist industry and for stories that reflected the complexity and contributions of New Orleans Black culture. About the same time that New Orleans turned almost exclusively to tourism to alleviate the problems of economic crisis following the oil bust and urban blight, the nation was experiencing an exponential rise of Black heritage tourism and increased marketing of African Americans' historical past by mainstream institutions. In New Orleans, the creation of the Louisiana Black Culture Commission in 1984, the New Orleans Black Tourism Network in 1990, the multicultural branch of the Louisiana Office of Tourism in 1996, and even mainstream tours celebrating racial and cultural diversity attempted to meet demands for a more inclusive, authentic representation of the city's African American past and provide opportunities for an economically viable future. However, the inclusion of African Americans in the tourism industry came at a cost. The new attention to multicultural New Orleans further entrenched the predominant tourism narrative of racial desire and disaster for three primary reasons. First, although the late 20th century tourism narrative often referenced and even staged Black history and cultural productions, such as traditional jazz performances, second-line parades, and voodoo ceremonies, tourism promoters did so primarily by exploiting and commodifying Black culture to suit mostly white visitors' expectations. Wrenched from their cultural and community context, these static performances of Black culture were physically and symbolically removed from local neighborhoods and living traditions characterized by resistance, survival, and innovation. By dissociating the city and its history from national and regional patterns of racial discrimination, violence, and Black struggles for liberation, New Orleans' construction as a multicultural city reinforced the idea that racism in the historic and contemporary city was either non-existent or aberrant. Secondly, because predominantly poor and working class African Americans had few employment options beyond the low-paying service industry, they were compelled by economic necessity to conform to these tourist performances that distorted and trivialized Black history and culture.